Welcome to Sleepy Time Stories. Hey dear friends, in the eastern part of America lies a place where the hills seem to exhale, where a soft haze never truly fades, where the long ridgelines answer to names far older than the country itself, and where the earth under your shoes guards secrets that no college textbook has ever fully faced. The Great Smoky Mountains welcome more than any other national park in the nation, drawing millions of visitors each and every year. People come for the sweeping views, for the animals, for the stillness. Yet hardly any of them understand what hides beneath the surface. Hardly any have listened to the whispers that geologists and archaeologists have quietly debated in meeting rooms and academic footnotes for well over 100 years. And almost no one knows about the passages. If you're listening to help yourself drift off, that is precisely why I create these recordings. Maybe consider subscribing and tell me where you are at this moment and what the clock says. There exists a kind of puzzle that feels different from normal questions. Normal questions come with answers simply waiting to be uncovered. You check the correct spot, you ask the correct person, you study the correct paper, and the solution arrives. But some mysteries push back against that process entirely. They gather clues instead of conclusions. They birth more queries with each solution that seems to appear. The passageways under the Smoky Mountains are that sort of mystery. The deeper you explore, the stranger and more layered the tale becomes. So, let's begin at the start, which also happens to be, rather fittingly, not fully clear. The Great Smoky Mountains rest along the border of Tennessee and North Carolina, stretching across the Appalachian Range in a section that geologists consider among the oldest exposed rock on the planet. These hills are ancient beyond simple understanding. Certain bedrock exposures have been measured at more than 300 million years old, from an era when the supercontinent Pangaea had just begun to break apart and the Atlantic Ocean did not yet exist in any shape we would recognize. These are not youthful peaks with dramatic volcanic edges. They are worn-down mountains softened by rain, by time, by the slow, steady squeeze of age. And whatever exists underneath them has existed there for an immense while. The Cherokee people, whose ancestors made their homes in and around these hills for thousands of years before Europeans arrived, called the Smokies something that roughly means the place of blue smoke. But they also held something else. They held stories, very precise stories handed down through spoken words across countless generations, about spots in the mountains where the earth was hollow, where routes led downward into shadow, where beings not entirely human and not entirely something different had built their homes long before the earliest Cherokee ancestor could recall. These stories were not treated as make-believe in the casual, dismissing way that the word myth tends to be used in Western academics. They were treated as truth, as records of real events and actual places, as geographic data woven into narrative shape. That difference matters greatly. When a culture encodes geography into its spoken traditions, the information tends to stay remarkably accurate over vast spans of time. Researchers have documented Aboriginal oral traditions in Australia that correctly describe coastlines and landforms as they existed more than 10,000 years ago, before sea levels rose at the end of the last ice age. The reliability of oral tradition when it comes to place and terrain is not debated among serious ethnographers. It is established fact. So when the Cherokee said that the Smoky Mountains held openings beneath them, and when they described those openings with enough detail that certain elders could point to approximate locations on a ridge or along a certain creek valley, that deserves more than a politely doubtful smile. The earliest written mentions of tunnel-like formations in the Smokies come from European explorers and surveyors in the late 1700s and early 1800s. These accounts are scattered among journals, letters, land records, and the occasional published travel story, none of which focus specifically on tunnel systems or underground structures. The references appear almost by accident, as small details along the edges of other tales. A surveyor named Amos Whitmore, working in the region sometime around 1830, wrote in a letter to a colleague that he had come across what he called a worked opening in the stone, roughly wide enough for two men to walk side by side, that slanted down into the hillside for a distance he guessed at considerably more than 100 yards before his torch gave out. He observed that the walls of the opening, which he touched repeatedly, felt smoother than natural erosion would create and showed faint carvings he could not recognize. He also observed that the air moving through the opening was warmer than the outside air, which struck him as odd given the depth and the time of year. Whitmore's letter exists in a private archive collection that has been referenced but not widely reproduced. Its authenticity has never been formally challenged, but neither has it been formally confirmed by any major historical institution. This pattern, documents living on the edges of the mainstream record, mentioned but not indexed, described but not scanned, appears again and again in the Smoky Mountains tunnel story. It is not itself proof of conspiracy or cover-up. Archival work is costly, incomplete, and systematically slanted toward documents that institutions consider historically important. What gets saved tends to reflect the priorities of those doing the saving. A surveyor's casual remarks about odd rock formations in the wilds of early 19th century Appalachia were not considered important, and so they were not treated as important, but they piled up over the following decades. Similar observations appeared in similar marginal contexts. A Cherokee guide in the 1850s reportedly led a small band of settlers to the mouth of what he called one of the old doors, a term that other accounts suggest was used more broadly among Cherokee elders to describe entry points to the underground network referenced in their traditions. The group apparently did not go far. The guide reportedly became uneasy and led them back out after a short time, offering an explanation that the surviving account rendered roughly as "it is not safe in the dying season," a phrase that remained puzzling to the settlers and has remained puzzling to researchers ever since. In the 1880s, a mining survey conducted in the region for a private land speculation company produced a report that described at least 3 locations where natural cave formations appeared to connect to passages that bore signs of intentional alteration. The report was commissioned to evaluate mineral potential in the area and was not, as far as can be determined, shared publicly. A reference to it appears in a later document produced by the Tennessee State Geological Office, which described the mining survey's findings as unusual and recommended further study that apparently never happened. The Geological Office reference itself has been cited by several independent researchers and at least one academic paper produced in the 1970s that examined pre-Columbian construction in the Appalachian region. Here it is worth pausing and addressing what honest engagement with this subject requires. The existence of natural cave systems in the Smoky Mountains and in the broader Appalachian region is entirely unremarkable. The limestone and other soluble rock formations throughout the Appalachians have produced some of the most extensive cave networks in North America. Mammoth Cave in Kentucky, a few hundred miles to the northwest, contains more than 400 miles of mapped passages. Luray Caverns in Virginia, just east of the main Appalachian Ridge, draws hundreds of thousands of visitors each year. The geology of the region is simply well suited to cave formation on a grand scale. Natural openings, natural caverns, natural underground rivers and rooms are expected features of this landscape. The question that the Smoky Mountains tunnel accounts raise is not whether underground passages exist. They do. The question is whether some of those passages show evidence of human alteration, human use, or human building that predates the historical period and cannot be explained by known cultures. And on that question, the honest answer is that we do not know, that the evidence is genuinely unclear, and that the tools that would allow us to find out have been applied only partly, unevenly, and in some cases apparently not at all. The Cherokee people themselves, or more accurately their descendants, and the scholars who have worked most closely with Cherokee oral tradition, offer several frameworks for understanding what the tunnels might represent and who might have made them or used them. The most prominent of these involves a tradition known in several variations across multiple southeastern indigenous cultures, the tradition of the Nunnehi. The Nunnehi are described in Cherokee tradition as a race of immortal beings, sometimes translated as the people who live anywhere or the travelers. They are not spirits in the way Western audiences typically understand that word. They are not ghosts or supernatural entities existing on a separate plane. They are, in the Cherokee telling, a parallel people, fully physical, capable of interacting with humans, but possessing abilities and traits that distinguish them from ordinary people. They are said to live mostly underground in great towns beneath the mountains and beneath the major rivers. They are described as friendly toward the Cherokee, occasionally helpful in times of crisis, and possessed of knowledge and abilities that exceed what the Cherokee themselves commanded. The Nunnehi tradition is not obscure. It appears prominently in the foundational ethnographic work of James Mooney, a Smithsonian ethnographer who spent years in the late 19th century documenting Cherokee culture and oral tradition. Mooney's work, published by the Bureau of American Ethnology in 1900 under the title Myths of the Cherokee, remains a primary academic source for Cherokee traditional knowledge and has been cited extensively across multiple academic disciplines. Mooney took the Nunnehi accounts seriously enough to document them in detail and to note that Cherokee informants consistently describe the underground towns of the Nunnehi as real places with specific locations that experienced Cherokee individuals had visited or had knowledge of. What Mooney did not do, and what essentially no mainstream researcher has done since, is connect the Nunnehi tradition to the physical evidence of underground passages in the Smoky Mountains region and ask whether the two bodies of information might be describing the same thing from different perspectives. This is a significant gap in method. Oral tradition and physical evidence are not normally treated as independent verification systems in American archaeology. They probably should be, at least in cases where the oral tradition is sufficiently specific and the physical evidence is sufficiently unusual. But they are not, and so the gap remains. To understand why that gap exists and why it has persisted for as long as it has, it helps to understand something about the history of American archaeology itself and about the particular intellectual and political climate that shaped how pre-Columbian North America came to be understood, or more precisely misunderstood, by the dominant academic tradition. For most of the 19th century, there was a serious and sustained attempt by American intellectuals, scientists, and politicians to demonstrate that the indigenous peoples of North America were incapable of the kinds of complex social organization and large-scale construction that the archaeological record clearly showed. The massive earthworks of the Mississippi Valley, the enormous geometric enclosures of the Ohio River region, the sophisticated urban centers of the Southwest, all of these were attributed by mainstream 19th century scholarship to lost races, Vikings, Welsh princes, the lost tribes of Israel, survivors of Atlantis, ancient Egyptians, visitors from any civilization that was not Native American. The actual ancestors of the people who were living in North America at the time of European contact were consistently excluded as possible builders of whatever was most impressive in the archaeological record. This was not subtle. It was explicit, systematic, and politically motivated. The argument that North American indigenous peoples had not built the impressive structures that the landscape contained was used directly to justify the dispossession of those peoples. The logic being that if they had not built it, they had not truly inhabited the land in any meaningful sense, and therefore the land was available for those who would build upon it. The mound builder controversy, as historians of science call it, was resolved definitively in favor of indigenous origin by the end of the 19th century, primarily through the work of Cyrus Thomas and the Bureau of Ethnology. But the resolution came late, and the intellectual habits it had nurtured persisted far longer than the specific claims they had supported. The relevance to the Smoky Mountains tunnels is this. American archaeology developed during a period when it was systematically disinclined to attribute significant pre-Columbian construction to indigenous North Americans. Even after the mound builder controversy was settled, the methodological caution that had been required to win that argument produced a discipline that was very wary of attributing underground construction to pre-Columbian North American peoples, because underground construction was seen as belonging to a different category of complexity than earthwork mounds, and because the Smoky Mountains region specifically had been less intensively studied than the Mississippi Valley or the Ohio region. The combination of methodological caution and insufficient field research meant that the tunnel question was never seriously engaged. It was acknowledged in footnotes and set aside in favor of more manageable problems. This is not a conspiracy. Conspiracies require active coordination, active suppression, active effort to prevent information from reaching the public. What happened with the Smoky Mountains tunnel question is something more ordinary and more systemic. It fell through the cracks of a discipline that was organized around different priorities, and it has remained in those cracks because the incentive structures of academic archaeology do not reward researchers for pursuing questions that the field has already, however implicitly, deemed not worth pursuing. But the questions have not gone away, and neither has the evidence. In the summer of 1972, a retired geological survey engineer named Harold Lester conducted an independent survey of several locations in the western Smokies that have been referenced in 19th century accounts. Lester was not an archaeologist and did not claim archaeological expertise. He was a practical man with surveying equipment and a systematic approach. He documented 14 locations where he observed what he described as passage openings that showed evidence inconsistent with purely natural formation. His report, self-published and circulated privately, was eventually referenced in a 1994 article in a small journal focused on alternative archaeology that has since ceased publication. The journal article was never peer-reviewed in any mainstream sense, and Lester's original report is difficult to obtain. But the specific observations Lester described are interesting in ways that go beyond what a self-publication or an alternative archaeology journal might suggest. He noted at several of the locations he surveyed that the passage walls showed a consistent angle of modification that he associated with deliberate tool work rather than natural erosion or fracturing. He noted that the floor surfaces at several locations showed a degree of smoothness inconsistent with a natural rock type, which was primarily metamorphic schist and gneiss, rock types that weather to rough, irregular surfaces rather than smooth ones. He noted that at 2 locations the passage orientation showed an alignment with cardinal directions that he calculated as unlikely to occur by chance in passages of that length. And he noted that at one location he observed what appeared to be a partially intact lintel, a doorframe cut from the rock approximately 4 feet high and 2.5 feet wide, with the remains of a threshold stone still in place. That last observation is the most striking and the most difficult to evaluate. A lintel doorframe cut from rock is not a natural formation. If Lester's observation was accurate, it would represent unambiguous evidence of constructed architecture in a pre-Columbian Appalachian underground context. It would be a discovery of enormous significance, and yet it has never been independently verified, because no mainstream researcher has returned to the location Lester identified to check. This is at this point in the story not surprising, but it is worth sitting with for a moment. The location is identifiable from Lester's description. The Smoky Mountains, despite their popularity as a tourist destination, contain enormous areas of wilderness that are rarely visited by anyone at all. The passage Lester described is not in a well-traveled area. A properly equipped team of archaeologists with a few days of field work could determine whether his observation was accurate or mistaken. That work has not been done, and the reason it has not been done is not logistical. It is a matter of priority and institutional will. What would motivate an archaeological institution to prioritize that kind of field work? Normally, it would be the existence of a documented site with strong preliminary evidence of significance. But in American archaeology, the existence of a documented site in the ethnographic record or in non-peer-reviewed literature does not automatically trigger formal investigation. There is a formal process of site nomination and review that tends to favor sites already known through mainstream research. Sites that exist only in the margins of the mainstream record have no automatic pathway to formal investigation. They require a champion within the institutional system, someone willing to stake professional reputation on what might turn out to be a dead end or a misidentification. That kind of champion has not yet emerged for the Smoky Mountains tunnel question, which means we are left for now with the evidence as it exists, incomplete, imperfectly documented, sourced from a combination of indigenous oral tradition, 19th century marginal accounts, early 20th century geological reports, and mid to late 20th century independent surveys. None of this constitutes proof of anything. But taken together, it constitutes a pattern that is very difficult to explain through coincidence alone. Let us follow that pattern further. There is a body of Cherokee oral tradition specifically associated with the Smoky Mountains that describes with unusual geographic precision a network of underground passages connecting the high peaks and major ridges of the range. The network is described as having been old when the first Cherokee ancestors arrived in the region, which would place its origins in, at minimum, the pre-woodland period of North American prehistory, meaning before roughly 3,000 years ago. It is described as having been used by the Nunnehi as a transportation and communication network, allowing movement across the mountain range without exposure to weather or to the dangers of the surface. It is described as having a number of specific entry points, some of which are still identified by location in contemporary Cherokee knowledge, though access to that specific knowledge is appropriately guarded. The geographic precision in these accounts is unusual. Oral traditions about underground places are common across many cultures worldwide, and they typically describe those places in terms that are impressionistic rather than geographically specific. The description of a land of the dead somewhere below, or a spirit world accessible through the earth, is a very different thing from a description of a passage that runs from the northeastern slope of a specific ridge to the valley floor of a named creek, intersecting with a secondary passage at a depth of approximately a certain number of body lengths below the surface. The latter kind of description is information. It is the kind of information that gets encoded in oral tradition when it describes something that exists and that people needed to be able to find. The Cherokee accounts of the Nunnehi tunnel network fall closer to the latter category than the former. They are not universally specific in the way a modern survey report would be, but they are far more geographically grounded than typical mythological underworld narratives. They describe the terrain above the passages in terms consistent with the actual terrain. They describe the passages in terms consistent with what natural and modified cave systems and metamorphic rock would plausibly look like. And they describe the passages as being connected in a way that implies a design network rather than a collection of independent formations. This is the part of the story where it is tempting to leap to conclusions, and it is worth resisting that temptation explicitly. The existence of Cherokee oral tradition describing underground passages does not prove that those passages were artificially constructed. It does not prove that any particular pre-Columbian culture built them. It does not prove that they represent anything other than a culturally significant and geographically informed description of natural cave formations that have been explored, named, and incorporated into Cherokee spiritual geography over many generations. What it proves is that there is something there, some combination of real underground formations and cultural knowledge about those formations that has been maintained across many generations. The question of what that something is, its extent, its origin, its significance, is exactly the question that has not been adequately investigated. There is also a separate body of evidence that does not come from oral tradition at all, that comes instead from the physical landscape itself and from the relatively sparse formal archaeological work that has been conducted in the Smokies region. The Appalachian Mountains, including the Smokies, were much more densely inhabited in the pre-Columbian period than the current distribution of archaeological sites might suggest. This is partly because the mountains were heavily logged during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, with the logging operations destroying surface archaeological evidence across enormous areas. It is partly because the establishment of the national park in 1934 involved the forced removal of communities that had been living in the mountains for generations, European American communities, as well as the remnant Cherokee communities that had managed to remain in the region after removal, and the subsequent reforestation of cleared land has obscured surface features. And it is partly because systematic archaeological survey of the park's interior has never been comprehensively conducted. What has been found suggests significant pre-Columbian occupation. There are documented site locations throughout the park and in the surrounding areas, including village sites, ceremonial sites, and extraction sites where specific minerals and materials were being obtained. Some of these sites date to the Archaic period, more than 7,000 years ago. The distribution of sites suggests that the mountains were used continuously and that the populations using them were engaged in trade networks that extended hundreds of miles in multiple directions, because materials found at Smoky Mountain sites originated from distant sources and materials from the Smokies appear at distant sites. This is not unusual for pre-Columbian North America. Long-distance trade networks were a consistent feature of indigenous American life for thousands of years before European contact. What is interesting about the Smoky Mountains specifically is the nature of some of what was being exchanged. Certain minerals found in the metamorphic rock of the Smokies were valued for ceremonial purposes across a wide geographic area. Mica in particular appears at major pre-Columbian ceremonial sites throughout the eastern United States in quantities that could only have come from Appalachian sources, and the Smoky Mountains region is one of the primary Appalachian mica sources. Copper from the Lake Superior region appears at Smoky Mountain sites. Marine shells from the Gulf Coast appear at Smoky Mountain sites. The mountains were not a backwater. They were a node in a continental network of exchange. A network of this kind requires infrastructure for extraction. The mica, in particular, which occurs in the metamorphic schist that makes up much of the Smoky Mountain subsurface, requires underground extraction once the surface deposits are exhausted. You cannot mine mica efficiently from the surface for very long. You have to follow the seams underground, and mining, unlike most other human activities, leaves behind very durable physical evidence. It leaves passages. The Cherokee were accomplished miners. Their traditions include specific knowledge of subsurface extraction, of following mineral seams, of preventing collapse, and of ventilating underground workings. This knowledge is documented in the ethnographic record, and it raises a straightforward question. If the Cherokee were mining mica and other materials from the Smoky Mountains subsurface across thousands of years. Where are the mining passages? Some of them have been found. There are documented pre-Columbian mining sites in the broader Appalachian mica belt that show evidence of underground work, small passages, extraction pits, tool marks in the rock. These sites are acknowledged in the archaeological literature, though they are not widely publicized. But they raise a further question. How extensive were those workings? And do they connect to the passages described in the oral tradition and in the 19th century accounts? The answer to those questions is genuinely unknown. The scale of pre-Columbian mica extraction from Appalachian sources was substantial. The quantities of mica found at major ceremonial sites hundreds of miles from the mountains imply extraction on a large scale over a long period of time. The kind of extraction that would leave behind a significant underground footprint. But that footprint has not been mapped. It has not been comprehensively surveyed. The portions of it that have been identified tend to be small and isolated, because the investigations that found them were not designed to look for a larger network. They were designed to document individual sites, and individual sites were what they found. There is also a separate line of evidence that comes from a very different source, from the accounts of early European American settlers who lived in and around the Smoky Mountains before the establishment of the national park. These accounts are preserved in a variety of forms: local histories, newspaper archives, church records, collections of oral history conducted by folklorists working in the region during the early 20th century, and the records of the Works Progress Administration, which conducted extensive oral history collection project throughout Appalachia during the 1930s. In these accounts, references to unusual underground features in the Smokies appear with a frequency that is striking once you start looking for them. A local history of Sevier County, Tennessee, published in 1936, mentions in a brief passage that settlers in one particular valley had discovered what they described as Indian caves that appeared to have been made rather than formed, with walls bearing marks that no natural process could explain. A WPA oral history from 1938 records the account of an elderly woman who described how her grandfather, one of the early settlers of Swain County, North Carolina, had encountered a passage in the mountains that he believed to be very old and very deep, and that he had been told by a Cherokee neighbor that the passage was one of many, and that they ran throughout the mountains like veins in a body. A newspaper account from a Knoxville paper in 1923 described the discovery by a hunting party of an entrance to what the account called a worked cavern in the eastern Smokies, with the hunters declining to enter beyond the opening because of the smell of the air, which one of them described as unlike any cave he had encountered before, not the cold mineral smell of natural caverns, but something warmer and more complex. Individually, each of these accounts can be questioned. Local histories written in the 19th century are not subject to peer review. WPA oral histories reflect the memories and interpretive frameworks of their subjects and the assumptions of the interviewers. Newspaper accounts of unusual discoveries in remote areas are notoriously unreliable. Any individual account in this collection could be misremembered, misinterpreted, exaggerated, or simply wrong. But the pattern of accounts across sources that are independent of each other, from settlers who had no particular reason to coordinate their stories, from oral histories collected decades apart in different counties, from newspaper accounts of different events at different times, that pattern is harder to dismiss. If the reports were the result of deliberate fabrication, they would tend to show consistent details borrowed from each other. They do not. They show the kind of variation that occurs when different people describe different encounters with similar phenomena. The passages are described as being in different locations. They are entered to different depths. The features that attract attention vary from account to account. The reactions of the people who encounter them vary. This is the signature of multiple independent encounters with real features, not the signature of a shared mythology being circulated and embellished. The temperature anomaly noted in several accounts is particularly interesting from a physical standpoint. Natural caves in the Smoky Mountains, as in most temperate regions, maintain a relatively constant temperature corresponding to the average annual surface temperature of the region, which in the Smokies is around 55 degrees Fahrenheit. A passage that is warmer than this would suggest either geothermal activity, which does not characterize the Smoky Mountains region, or a volume of enclosed underground space large enough that it retains the heat of biological processes, decomposing organic material, or simply the accumulated warmth of enclosed air over long periods. A large enclosed underground network would over time develop a thermal profile somewhat distinct from small, isolated natural caverns. The accounts describing warm air in the passages might be consistent with a larger, more interconnected underground system than isolated natural caverns would produce. This is speculative. It is worth being clear about that. The thermal observations in historical accounts are not control measurements. They are subjective impressions recorded by people who are not trying to gather scientific data. But they are consistent across accounts from different sources and different time periods. And consistency across independent sources is a form of evidence, even when the evidence is soft. Let us now turn to something that has remained almost entirely outside the published discussion of the Smoky Mountains tunnels, but that may be one of the most important pieces of context for understanding what the tunnels might represent and where they might have originated. The Appalachian Mountains geologically are the eroded remnants of a mountain chain that at its peak roughly 300 to 350 million years ago rivaled the modern Himalayas in height. The slow erosion of those ancient peaks over hundreds of millions of years deposited sediment across what is now the central and eastern United States, creating the rock formations that contain some of North America's most extensive natural cave systems. But the metamorphic core of the Appalachians, which includes the Smoky Mountains, was not eroded away. It was buried beneath younger rocks and then exposed again as those younger rocks were removed by subsequent erosion. The result is that the metamorphic basement of the Smokies contains features that have been forming, evolving, and changing for an almost incomprehensibly long time. Within metamorphic rock of the type found in the Smokies, natural passage formation is different from the karst caves formed in limestone. Limestone caves form through the chemical dissolution of the rock by slightly acidic water. Metamorphic caves form through a combination of tectonic fracturing, the movement of hot mineral-rich fluids through the rock, and the mechanical erosion of those fractures by water over very long periods. The result tends to be narrower, more irregular, and more complex in 3 dimensions than limestone caves, but also potentially very extensive because the fracture networks in metamorphic rock can extend for great distances. What this means is that the Smoky Mountains are geologically capable of containing an extensive natural fracture passage network that has been available for human exploration and modification for as long as humans have been in the region. The natural substrate exists. The question of whether it was modified and to what degree is the question that remains open. In the mid-1990s, a small group of independent researchers working with ground-penetrating radar and other remote sensing technologies conducted surveys at several locations in the Smoky Mountains that have been identified in historical accounts as potential tunnel access points. The group was not affiliated with any academic institution, and their work was not submitted to peer-reviewed journals. Their findings, published on a website that has since become difficult to access in its original form, described anomalous subsurface features at several of the surveyed locations. Features that the radar return suggested were enclosed spaces rather than solid rock at depths ranging from a few meters to more than 20 meters. Ground-penetrating radar is a legitimate technology with genuine scientific applications, and its use in archaeological survey is well established. The interpretation of radar returns from complex metamorphic subsurface environments is also genuinely challenging, and the possibility of misidentification of natural fracture networks as artificial passages is real. The independent researchers who conducted these surveys did not have the geological expertise to definitively distinguish between natural and modified underground features based on radar returns alone. Their conclusions were therefore necessarily provisional. But the locations of the anomalies they identified were strikingly consistent with several of the historical accounts. At one location in particular, a site in the western part of the park that had been referenced in both Cherokee oral tradition and in a 19th century settler account, the radar survey showed what appeared to be a linear feature extending at a consistent depth for more than 100 meters before the equipment's range was exhausted. A natural fracture in metamorphic rock can certainly extend for more than 100 meters, but a fracture of consistent depth and linear orientation over that distance in a terrain as topographically complex as the Smokies would be unusual. Linear features in natural fracture networks tend to follow the orientation of the regional stress field and the foliation of the rock, which in the Smokies is generally oriented northeast to southwest. A feature extending in a different orientation with consistent depth over a long distance would be more difficult to attribute to purely natural processes. The independent researchers noted this, and they also noted that the orientation of the anomaly they detected corresponded approximately to the orientation described in the oral tradition they were working from, which pointed toward a passage aligned roughly with the flow direction of a major creek in the area. Whether that correspondence is meaningful or coincidental cannot be determined from their data alone. What it represents is a lead that has not been followed. It is worth stepping back at this point and asking a question that the preceding material might seem to make obvious, but that actually requires careful examination. Why would anyone build tunnels through the Smoky Mountains? What purpose would an underground network in this region serve? The trade network function has already been mentioned. The ability to move goods and people through the mountains without weather exposure and without visibility from above would have been a significant logistical advantage for a population engaged in long-distance trade across a mountain range. The Smokies sit astride the main divide of the southern Appalachians, and crossing them on the surface requires either navigating high exposed ridges or following the creek valleys, which are slow and indirect routes. A passage through the mountain at a consistent depth would, depending on its orientation, provide a much more direct route between the Tennessee Valley side and the valleys of western North Carolina. This is not merely theoretical. There are documented examples from other parts of the world of ancient underground passage systems that serve precisely this function. The Kanat systems of the Middle East and Central Asia, for example, are networks of underground channels constructed thousands of years ago that moved water from mountain aquifers to lowland agricultural areas over distances of many kilometers. Some of these systems are more than 2,000 years old, and yet they are so well constructed that portions of them are still functional today. The Inca of the Andes constructed underground storage chambers and passage systems throughout the Cordillera that connected the imperial road network to underground facilities that could supply armies and trade caravans regardless of surface weather conditions. The Romans constructed underground passages throughout their empire for water management, for military purposes, and for ceremonial functions. Underground construction is not an exotic or extraordinary human capability. It is something that organized human communities have undertaken on every inhabited continent. What would be extraordinary about underground construction in the Smoky Mountains is not the construction itself, but the absence from the mainstream historical record of any acknowledgement that it occurred. And that absence, as has been discussed, is at least partly explicable through the history of American archaeology and the dynamics of academic priority setting, rather than through any intrinsic implausibility in the idea of pre-Columbian underground construction. In the region, there is also a ceremonial dimension to consider. The underground was not simply a practical space for pre-Columbian North American cultures. It was a sacred space, a liminal zone between the world of ordinary human experience and the world of spiritual reality. This is expressed across many traditions. The Pueblo peoples of the Southwest built kivas, semi-underground ceremonial chambers, as central features of their communities. The mound builders of the Mississippi Valley constructed earthen chambers that served ceremonial as well as mortuary functions. The cave systems of the Yucatan were considered sacred entrances to the underworld by the Maya and were used for ceremonial purposes, including sacrifice and divination, for thousands of years. The pattern of treating underground space as spiritually significant is so consistent across pre-Columbian North and Central American cultures that it would actually be more surprising if the inhabitants of the Smoky Mountains had not accorded underground space ceremonial significance. The Cherokee tradition of the Nunnehi, living underground, and the associated tradition of underground towns that are accessible to living humans under the right conditions fits this broader pattern perfectly. The underground towns of the Nunnehi are not exactly the afterlife, and they're not exactly a spiritual dimension. They're described as parallel places accessible from this world, but operating according to different rules. This is consistent with how many indigenous American cultures have described liminal underground spaces. And it suggests that whatever was in the Smoky Mountains tunnels, if tunnels existed in the form described, served not only a practical function, but a ceremonial and cosmological one as well. The Nunnehi are also described in some accounts as having knowledge of healing, of plant medicine, and of practices that the Cherokee sought out in times of crisis. There are accounts of sick or injured people being taken underground by the Nunnehi and returning healed, or of Cherokee warriors seeking guidance from Nunnehi before major conflicts. This pattern, the underground as a place of specialized knowledge and power, is again consistent with how many cultures have used actual underground spaces. Specific caves and chambers were reserved for initiation, for healing rituals, for consultation with spiritual authorities, and for the training of ritual specialists. The underground was not simply another room. It was a different kind of space with different properties, different rules, and different inhabitants. If the Smoky Mountains tunnel system existed as described, it would have been both a practical infrastructure and a sacred geography simultaneously. These two functions are not in tension with each other. They reinforce each other. The practical value of the passage network would have been enhanced by its sacred status, because sacred sites tend to be maintained, protected, and transmitted across generations more reliably than purely practical infrastructure. And the sacred significance of the underground would have been grounded in the concrete experience of actually using the passages, actually moving through the mountain in the dark, actually encountering the physical reality of a space that ordinary surface life gave no preparation for. This is something worth dwelling on. Moving through a passage in the rock of a mountain in darkness broken only by torchlight, with the weight of the mountain above you and the sound of deep water somewhere ahead or below, is a fundamentally different kind of human experience from anything available on the surface. It changes your relationship to the scale of the world, to the permanence of the earth, to the smallness of the human body in relation to the geological forces that shape the terrain. Cultures that regularly inhabited and used underground spaces developed cosmologies that reflected that experience. The underground was not a metaphor for something else. It was a real place that inspired the metaphors. There is a particular geological feature of the Smoky Mountains that connects the physical landscape to the ceremonial traditions in a way that has not been widely discussed in the context of the tunnel question. The mountains, as noted, are composed primarily of metamorphic rock, schist, and gneiss, with intrusions of other rock types, including quartzite and occasional marble lenses. The marble, where it occurs, is a chemically reactive rock type that has been subject to dissolution by the slightly acidic groundwater flowing through the region for millions of years. The result is that where marble lenses occur within the metamorphic sequence, there are likely to be karst features, caverns, and passages formed by dissolution embedded within the broader matrix of metamorphic rock. These marble lenses are not random in their occurrence. They follow the foliation of the metamorphic sequence and tend to occur in specific zones within the mountains. Some of these zones have been mapped by geological surveys, but the surveys have focused on the surface expression of the marble and have not systematically investigated the extent of dissolution features in the subsurface. This is a significant gap. Karst passages within a metamorphic matrix would be exactly the kind of hybrid underground feature that would be both naturally formed and potentially very extensive, and that might also, in some sections, show evidence of human modification. Because the naturally smooth walls and floors of dissolution caves are much more amenable to human use and modification than the rough, fractured surfaces of metamorphic passages. A system of this kind, combining natural dissolution passages in marble lenses with naturally fractured passages in the metamorphic rock between them, would explain some of the variation in accounts. Some passages are described as smooth and regular, consistent with dissolution features. Others are described as rougher and more irregular, consistent with natural fracture passages. Both types appear in the historical accounts. And if they are all part of the same broader network, connected by the fact that they all ultimately follow the same structural geology, that variation would make sense. There's also the question of what happened to this network over time. The Smoky Mountains have been subjected to intense seismic activity at various points in their history. The region is seismically active by Eastern North American standards, though far less so than the Pacific coast. Major seismic events over the last several thousand years would have caused collapse in some sections of any underground passage network, would have blocked some entry points with debris, and would have created new fractures and openings in other locations. The passage network, if it existed, is almost certainly not in the same condition as it was when it was most actively used. Many sections may be completely inaccessible. Others may have new surface openings created by seismic collapse or erosion that do not correspond to the entry points described in older accounts. This adds another layer of complexity to the question of investigation. Even if a research team committed to systematically searching for the tunnel network, they would not necessarily find what they were looking for by looking in the places described in historical accounts. The landscape has changed. The entry points may have moved or disappeared. New access points may have appeared in unexpected locations. A comprehensive investigation would require systematic remote sensing of large areas combined with targeted ground investigation wherever the remote sensing suggested subsurface voids. This is logistically complex and expensive, but it is not technically impossible. It is again a matter of institutional will and research priority. The question of who built the tunnels, if they were built, and when, is one that any serious investigation would need to engage with, and it is one for which there are several plausible frameworks. The oldest possibility is that the passages represent a feature of the landscape that predates any known human occupation of the region, and that was discovered and used by the first human inhabitants of the Appalachians, whenever that was. The earliest confirmed human presence in the Appalachian region dates to approximately 13,000 years ago during the late Paleo-Indian period, when the first people crossed the region following the retreat of the glaciers and the megafauna that provided their primary food source. These were highly mobile, technologically sophisticated people with detailed knowledge of landscape and terrain. They would have been aware of subsurface features in their territory, and they would have had the practical intelligence to use those features for shelter and protection. Modifications they made to natural passages would be extremely difficult to detect archaeologically, both because the tools and methods of Paleo-Indian cultures are not well suited to leaving identifiable marks in metamorphic rock, and because 13,000 years of subsequent use and natural change would have obscured any evidence of initial modification. A somewhat later possibility is that the passages represent an archaic period or early woodland period construction or modification project. The archaic period in the eastern United States, from approximately 8,000 to 3,000 years ago, was characterized by increasing sedentism, increasing social complexity, and increasing investment in infrastructure, including earthworks and in some areas underground features. The populations of the Appalachian region during this period were engaged in the trade networks that distributed mica and other materials across the eastern United States, and the mining and processing infrastructure required for that trade could plausibly have included underground workings on a significant scale. A still later possibility is that the passages represent Cherokee construction or modification from the period of Cherokee occupation of the region, which according to oral tradition and the archaeological record extended back at least 1,000 years and possibly much longer. The Cherokee had the knowledge, the tools, and the organizational capacity to construct and maintain underground passages, and they had a cultural and ceremonial framework that would have motivated that investment. The Nunnehi tradition might represent, in this case, a mythologized account of an actual historical project, the construction of an underground network by one generation being reinterpreted by subsequent generations as the work of supernatural beings, a pattern that is documented in other cultures as well. None of these possibilities can be confirmed or excluded with the current evidence. The most likely answer, if the passages exist in the form described, is probably some combination of all three. Natural passages that were discovered and used in the Paleo-Indian period, expanded and modified during the Archaic period as mining and trade infrastructure, and incorporated into Cherokee ceremonial geography during the more recent period of Cherokee occupation, with the accumulation of cultural memory about the passages being expressed in the Nunnehi tradition. But this is inference from incomplete evidence. It is the most plausible reconstruction given what is known, not a confirmed account of what happened. What happens to this story from here depends on factors that are not entirely predictable. The advancement of remote sensing technology is making subsurface investigation less intrusive and more comprehensive. LiDAR, which uses airborne laser scanning to produce extremely detailed three-dimensional maps of terrain, has in recent years transformed archaeological survey in forested areas by penetrating the forest canopy to reveal surface features that were previously invisible from the air. The same technology adapted for ground-penetrating applications is increasingly capable of revealing subsurface features in complex geological environments. A systematic LiDAR survey of the Smoky Mountains combined with ground-penetrating radar at identified anomaly locations would produce significantly better data than anything currently available. The political landscape of indigenous heritage management in the United States has also shifted significantly in recent decades. The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act and related legislation have given indigenous communities more meaningful participation in decisions about the management of sites of cultural significance on federal land, including national parks. The eastern band of Cherokee Indians, which maintains a reservation adjacent to the national park, has formal consultation rights regarding archaeological work in the park, and the tribe has shown increasing interest in documentation of its pre-removal cultural heritage. A research project developed in genuine partnership with the tribal community, incorporating indigenous knowledge and respecting indigenous protocols around sacred sites, would have both a stronger ethical foundation and potentially better access to the specific local knowledge that could guide investigation toward the most productive locations. There is also increasingly an audience for this kind of work. The public interest in pre-Columbian North American complexity has grown substantially in recent years, driven partly by the increasing accessibility of archaeological literature, partly by documentaries and popular science content that takes pre-Columbian achievements seriously, and partly by a broader cultural shift toward recognizing and engaging with indigenous history on its own terms, rather than through the distorting lens of 19th century prejudice. Research that takes the Smoky Mountains tunnel question seriously, that approaches it with appropriate methodological rigor, while also engaging honestly with the oral tradition and historical accounts that constitute the primary evidence, would find an interested audience and could attract the funding and institutional support that have been lacking. The tunnels, if they are there, have waited a very long time to be found. They have been noted in the margins and then set aside. They have been described by people who lack the expertise or institutional position to compel formal investigation. They have been maintained in oral tradition by a community whose knowledge was systematically devalued and whose access to their own heritage was severely constrained by the historical processes of dispossession and forced removal that have shaped the region's history. None of that makes them more likely to exist in the exact form that the most dramatic accounts describe. Mystery is always partly in the eye of the beholder, and the desire for mystery can distort perception just as powerfully as the desire to dismiss it. But the balance of evidence suggests that something is beneath the Smokies, something that was known to the people who lived there longest, something that was glimpsed and noted by the people who came after and then not adequately followed up on, something that the geological character of the mountains is entirely capable of accommodating. That something deserves more than footnotes and independent surveys and alternative archaeology journals. It deserves the serious, systematic, properly resourced investigation that any genuinely unusual body of evidence should receive. The Great Smoky Mountains are the most visited national park in the United States. The question of what exists beneath them is not a marginal curiosity. It is a question about the deep history of a place that millions of people care about, and about the deep history of the people who lived in that place for thousands of years before the national park existed. The smoke that hangs over the mountains most mornings is not, geologically speaking, smoke at all. It is organic compounds released by the vast forest covering the ridges and valleys, compounds that scatter light and create the blue haze that the Cherokee named the mountains for. But it looks like smoke. It looks like something is burning somewhere beneath the surface, some slow combustion that the mountain cannot quite contain. The people who lived in these mountains for thousands of years knew the difference between the haze of evaporating forest and the smoke of a real fire. They knew the terrain with the intimacy that comes from long habitation. And they said that beneath the mountains there was another world. We have not yet taken that claim seriously enough to find out whether they were right. The Nunnehi stories that undergird so much of what is known about the Smoky Mountains tunnels are not uniform across the Cherokee oral tradition. There are variations, regional differences in how the underground beings are described, in what the passages connect, in what the rules of access are, and in what happens to humans who enter. These variations are not the sign of confused mythology. They're the sign of a rich, living tradition that was different in different communities, that reflected the specific geography and local knowledge of each group. And in those variations, there are sometimes details that do not appear in the most commonly cited versions, details that push the story in directions that the standard summary does not capture. One of these details involves water, Several versions of the Nunnehi tradition describe the underground passages as following underground waterways, rivers, and streams that flow through the mountains below the surface. The connection between underground passages and underground water is geologically sound. In the marble lenses and in fracture zones within the metamorphic rock, groundwater does flow in concentrated channels rather than diffusing evenly through the rock. These subsurface streams can be substantial, carrying volumes of water that feed the numerous springs and seeps that characterize the Smoky Mountains' surface hydrology. The tradition of passages following underground water would be consistent with a situation in which natural water channels have been exploited and modified to create a navigable underground network, using the water channels as the foundation for a human-modified passage system. This is a construction approach that has been documented in other contexts. The Canaan systems of the Middle East mentioned earlier work precisely by following underground water channels, and the Anatolian and Persian engineers who built them were doing something not conceptually different from what the Nunnehi tradition describes. Whether independently invented or reflecting some broader human insight about the relationship between underground water and underground passage construction, the approach makes engineering sense. Following water finds the path of least resistance through rock. Enlarging and lining those water channels creates passages that have natural drainage and a degree of environmental stability that dry passages lack. The accounts that describe the underground passages as following creek systems also make sense from a geographic standpoint. The major creek valleys of the Smoky Mountains run roughly perpendicular to the main divide of the range, cutting through the mountains from the Tennessee side to the North Carolina side in deep, narrow gorges. The underground drainage systems of the mountains would follow the same general orientation as the surface drainage. Passages that followed underground water would therefore, in broad terms, provide the same mountain crossing routes that the surface creek valleys provide, but at a lower and more protected elevation. The Cherokee oral tradition specifically describes at least some of the underground passages as crossing the main divide, which is exactly what the underground drainage system of the mountains does. This specificity, the alignment of the described passage orientation with what we would expect from the actual hydrology of the mountains, is another form of the geographic precision that distinguishes the Nunnehi account from typical mythological underworld narratives. A story invented to explain the mystery of the underground would not necessarily be constrained to follow the actual drainage patterns of a specific mountain range. The fact that it does suggest that the tradition is describing real features of a real landscape. There is also the question of the animals. Multiple accounts in the Cherokee tradition and in the European American settler accounts describe the underground passages as inhabited not only by the Nunnehi, but by animals that are unusual in some way. In the Cherokee accounts, some of these animals are clearly supernatural spirit animals that serve as guardians or messengers. But other animal descriptions in the accounts are more straightforwardly naturalistic. They describe large fish in underground streams, particular species of blind or pale salamanders, and in some cases bats in very large numbers. The fish and salamanders in particular are interesting. The Smoky Mountains and surrounding Appalachian region are home to an extraordinary diversity of freshwater fish and amphibian species, including many cave-adapted species that have evolved in the underground waterway system over long periods. The cave crayfish and cave salamanders of the Appalachian cave systems are well documented by biologists, and some species are known from only a handful of locations. The presence of unusual or specialized aquatic animals in the underground passages described in the tradition would be exactly what you would expect if those passages were genuine underground features connected to the regional groundwater system. It is not proof, but it is consistent. The bat accounts are similarly interesting. Bats that roost in large numbers in underground spaces are a well-known feature of cave ecosystems, and the Appalachian region has historically supported large bat populations in its cave systems. A passage network large enough to support major bat colonies would need to have significant volume, multiple levels of air circulation, and access to sufficient foraging territory above ground. The accounts that describe bat emergence from underground passage openings, with descriptions of the animals rising from the earth in great clouds at dusk, are consistent with what observers of large bat colonies would actually see. They are also notably a reliable indicator to an informed observer of where significant underground space is located. Major bat emergences are visible and memorable, and would be encoded in the geographic memory of any culture that inhabited the region. If the Smoky Mountains tunnel network exists and has large bat colonies associated with it, the locations of those colonies might still be detectable today through wildlife surveys. Bat populations have declined catastrophically in the eastern United States in recent decades due to the fungal disease white nose syndrome. But prior to this epidemic, the Appalachian bat populations were extensive, and the locations of major roost caves were documented by wildlife biologists working in the region. A comparison of documented major roost locations with the geographic indicators in historical and oral tradition accounts might provide a new class of evidence linking specific locations to the described tunnel network. This kind of cross-referencing of different types of evidence, oral tradition, historical accounts, geological inference, wildlife data, and remote sensing is exactly the methodology that a serious investigation of the Smoky Mountains tunnels would employ. No single line of evidence is sufficient. The case for the existence of the tunnel network rests on the accumulation of multiple independent lines of evidence that are individually inconclusive, but collectively form a pattern that is difficult to attribute to coincidence. The strength of the case is also the reason it has been difficult to address. Each individual line of evidence falls short of the threshold that any single discipline would require for formal recognition. The oral tradition is a cultural artifact. The historical accounts lack authentication. The geological arguments are inferential. The remote sensing data is ambiguous. The wildlife connections are speculative. Each discipline that might evaluate the question can find a reason to defer to another discipline or to set the question aside as insufficiently rigorous for formal engagement. The result is a question that is collectively owned by no discipline and therefore not pursued by any. This is a structural problem in how complex interdisciplinary questions get handled within the academic system. And the Smoky Mountains tunnel question is far from the only instance of it. Many of the most interesting questions in pre-Columbian North American studies fall into this same gap. Too interdisciplinary to be owned by any single field, too unconventional to attract mainstream funding, too complex to be resolved by the kind of site-specific investigation that standard archaeology produces. The resolution to structural problems of this kind usually comes from outside the structures that create them. It comes from independent researchers who are willing to pursue questions across disciplinary boundaries, from documentary and journalistic projects that bring public attention to overlooked evidence, from citizen science initiatives that can conduct survey and monitoring over larger areas than professional research budgets allow, and from the occasional institutional champion who decides that the question is worth taking on. In the case of the Smoky Mountains tunnels, one piece of the puzzle that has not yet been mentioned is the role of the national park itself in shaping what research is possible. The Great Smoky Mountains National Park is managed by the National Park Service, which has a complex and sometimes contradictory mandate regarding archaeological research within the park. The park contains an estimated 1,000 known archaeological sites, and surveys have identified many more potential sites than have been formally documented. The park's archaeological staff manages a significant workload with limited resources, and the priority given to any particular investigation reflects both resource constraints and the perceived significance of the site relative to other known sites and known questions. For the tunnel question to receive formal Park Service investigation, it would need to be framed as a question of sufficient significance relative to the existing management priorities of the park. This is not a trivial threshold to meet. The park has well-documented sites of clear significance that it does not have sufficient resources to investigate comprehensively. Directing those resources toward a question whose subject matter is itself uncertain is a difficult case to make within normal resource allocation frameworks. But the National Park Service also has formal relationships with the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians that go beyond ordinary government-to-government consultation. The tribe has cultural patrimony interests in the park that are recognized by federal law and that create a basis for cooperative research initiatives. A research project that was formally endorsed by the tribal nation and structured as a cooperative effort between the tribe, the Park Service, and academic researchers would have a significantly different political and institutional standing than an independent investigation by outside researchers. It would also have access to tribal knowledge resources that independent researchers cannot access, and it would have the moral authority that comes from being grounded in the legitimate interests of the people whose heritage is at stake. The possibility of such a cooperative project is not purely theoretical. The Eastern Band has been increasingly proactive in engaging with questions of pre-removal cultural heritage, and the Park Service has shown increasing willingness to support cooperative research with tribal partners. The infrastructure for a serious investigation of the Smoky Mountains underground exists. What it lacks is a specific project proposal that brings the relevant parties together around a shared research question. This is in the end both the most frustrating and the most hopeful aspect of the Smoky Mountains tunnel story. The question is real. The evidence is real, if incomplete. The means to pursue the question more rigorously exist. The institutional and community relationships that could support a formal investigation are present. What is needed is the decision to prioritize this question, to commit the necessary resources and attention to an investigation that might confirm, refute, or substantially complicate the picture that the current evidence presents. The mountains do not give up their secrets easily. They have been keeping this one for a very long time. The mist lies in the valleys every morning and rises through the day, and the ridges stand as they have stood for millions of years, holding whatever is beneath them with geological patience. The Cherokee name for this place invokes the blue smoke that the living forest breathes into the atmosphere. But the Cherokee also knew that the mountains breathed in another way, through openings in the rock, where the air moved differently, where the temperature was wrong for the season, where the sound of the mountain was not the sound of wind through trees, but something older, something that came from deeper in. Every serious tradition of human knowledge contains a version of this understanding, that the surface of things is not all of things, that what lies beneath is at least as important as what lies above. That the earth itself is not simply a platform for human activity, but a layered reality with its own depth and complexity and history. The tunnels of the Smoky Mountains, if they are what the evidence suggests they might be, are an invitation to take that understanding seriously, not as mythology, not as metaphor, but as a physical fact about a particular landscape that has been inhabited by human beings for a very long time, and that those human beings came to know in ways that we have barely begun to recover. The investigation that this evidence calls for has not yet happened. It might happen in our lifetimes, or it might require another generation of researchers and advocates and tribal community members to bring it to the point where institutional systems take it seriously. But the evidence is not going away. The mountains are not going anywhere. And the questions the tunnels pose about who was here, how long they were here, what they knew, and what they built are questions that will not resolve themselves through neglect. They require that someone go looking with the right tools, the right partners, the right questions, and the willingness to find whatever is actually there rather than what anyone expected to find. The smoke still rises over the mountains every morning. The mist still fills the valleys. And somewhere beneath the oldest peaks in eastern North America, the answer to one of the region's most enduring mysteries waits in the dark, as patient as the rock itself, for someone to bring a light. The story of the Smoky Mountains tunnels does not end with the physical evidence, or even with the possibility of future investigation. There is a philosophical dimension to this question that extends beyond the specific case and touches something fundamental about how we understand the human past and our relationship to the landscapes we inhabit. The dominant narrative of pre-Columbian North America, even in its most generous contemporary form, tend to present the continent as a collection of separate cultures operating in relative isolation, each with its own local history and its own local landscape knowledge. The great mound-building civilizations of the Mississippi Valley, the sophisticated societies of the Ohio region, the complex Pueblo cultures of the Southwest. These are acknowledged as impressive, but they are often presented as exceptions in a broader story of simple forager societies living lightly on the land. The idea of a continental-scale interconnected civilization with sophisticated infrastructure, including underground construction, is in this narrative anachronistic, something that belongs to the old world, not to the new. But this narrative does not fit the evidence. The trade networks of pre-Columbian North America were genuinely continental in scope. Copper from the Great Lakes appeared at sites in Florida and in the Rockies. Obsidian from Yellowstone appeared at sites in Ohio. Marine shells from both coasts appeared at inland sites thousands of miles from the ocean. Mica from the Appalachians appeared at Hopewell ceremonial sites throughout the Midwest. These materials did not travel by accident. They moved through organized networks of exchange involving multiple communities across thousands of miles, sustained over hundreds of years. A trade network of that scale and duration is not the product of simple societies. It requires something like political infrastructure, agreements between communities, reliable routes, established protocols of exchange, and the organizational capacity to move goods efficiently across long distances. Some of that infrastructure was undoubtedly above ground. But in a landscape like the Appalachian Mountains, where weather and terrain present serious challenges to surface travel, some of it may have been below ground. The Smoky Mountains sit at the geographic heart of the Appalachian Mica Belt, and at the nexus of several of the major trade routes that connected the Gulf Coast to the Great Lakes and the Mississippi Valley to the Atlantic seaboard. Their position in the continental exchange network of pre-Columbian North America was not peripheral. It was central, and the question of how the communities at that nexus managed and organized that position, what infrastructure they built, what knowledge they maintained, and what relationship they had to the landscape they inhabited, is a question of genuine historical significance. The tunnels, if they exist in the form the evidence suggests, would be a piece of that infrastructure. They would be a component of the organizational apparatus that made the Appalachian Trade Network function. And their existence would require us to think somewhat differently about what pre-Columbian North American societies were capable of and what they actually did. This is not a dramatic revision of the historical picture. It does not require us to abandon the established framework of North American prehistory or to accept any of the more exotic fringe theories about the origins of pre-Columbian civilization. It requires only that we take seriously the possibility that communities engaged in large-scale, long-distance trade across a complex mountain terrain might have invested in the kind of underground infrastructure that would make that trade more reliable and more efficient. That is not a radical claim. It is a straightforward extension of what we already know about pre-Columbian North American economic organization. The Smoky Mountains have always been a place where the ordinary and the extraordinary coexist. The wildflowers on the high meadows in spring are among the most diverse in the world. The salamander diversity in the mountain streams represents a biological heritage that stretches back to the ancient tropical forests of the Paleozoic. The human history of the place extends back to a time when the large mammals that the first people hunted are now known only from fossil deposits. Every layer of this history is present in the landscape, encoded in the rock and the soil, and the living community of species that makes its home there. The tunnels, if they are there, are another layer of that history, a human layer, encoding the intelligence and the effort and the specific local knowledge of people who lived in these mountains for thousands of years and left their mark on them in ways that the subsequent centuries have almost hidden. Almost, but not quite. The blue haze still rises from the ridges every morning. The mountains breathe, and somewhere beneath the oldest peaks, in the dark and the quiet and the cool of the rock, the work of people whose names we do not know, and whose story we have not yet fully told, continues to wait. There is something that feels right about a mystery that keeps waiting, that does not resolve itself prematurely, that does not yield to easy answers or convenient narratives, that holds its ground in the face of skepticism and neglect alike. The Smoky Mountains tunnels are that kind of mystery. They have been there for a long time. They will be there for a long time more. And the people who eventually go looking for them with the right equipment and the right questions and the right relationships with the communities whose heritage is at stake will find something. Whatever they find, it will be more interesting than the absence of investigation that currently characterizes our relationship to this question. The mountains keep their secrets well, but they do not keep them forever. The rock erodes, the forest changes, the water finds new channels, and eventually the thing that was hidden comes to light. Sometimes it takes a geologist's hammer. Sometimes it takes a remote sensing array. Sometimes it takes the sustained attention of a community that refuses to let the question drop. The Smoky Mountains tunnels need all three. They need the tools, the technology, and the commitment. And they need, perhaps most of all, the people who are willing to take seriously what the Cherokee elders have been saying for as long as anyone has been listening. That beneath the mountains, in the dark and the deep and the quiet of the ancient rock, there's another world. One that we have not yet fully entered and that we do not yet fully understand. But we could. That is the remarkable thing. We actually could. The tools exist. The knowledge exists. The institutional relationships that could make formal investigation possible exist. All that is needed is the decision, made by someone with the capacity to act on it, that this question is worth pursuing. That the Blue Smoke Mountains and what lies beneath them deserve the full attention of the full range of human inquiry that is available to us. Until that decision is made, the tunnels wait as they have always waited, with a patience that only stone and the darkness behind stone can truly possess. And when you walk the trails of the Smokies on a quiet morning, when the mist is still in the valleys and the air has that particular coolness that precedes the heat of the day, it is worth pausing for a moment and thinking about what is beneath your feet. About the millions of years of geological history that produced the rock under the soil. About the thousands of years of human history that produced the paths you are walking. About the possibility that somewhere in the mountain you are standing on, there's a passage that a person walked before the memory of the oldest living person's oldest ancestor. A passage cut or followed or used by someone who knew this landscape in a way you never will. Who understood the mountain from the inside out and who left behind something that we have not yet found. The mountains breathe blue smoke into the sky every morning. The answer breathes with them, waiting to be asked for properly, waiting for someone to follow the smoke back to its source, down through the rock and the time and the dark, to whatever is waiting there. We can hope that someone will. The evidence suggests that it would be worth their while. There is a historian whose name does not appear in any major university press publication, who spent most of his adult life in a small house near the edge of the national park boundary in Swain County, North Carolina. His name was I.S. Cornstalk Birdsong, and he was of mixed Cherokee and Scots-Irish descent, a combination that was common in the mountains, and that gave him a kind of double inheritance. The oral tradition of the Cherokee communities his grandmother had grown up in, and the documentary instinct of the Scots-Irish Presbyterian tradition that had produced generations of meticulous record keepers in the Appalachian valleys. He spent 40 years, from roughly 1920 to his death in 1960, collecting every reference he could find to the underground passages of the Smokies, in newspaper archives, in county histories, in church records, in the oral accounts of elderly neighbors, and in the Cherokee language materials that he was one of a small number of non-tribal members capable of reading. Birdsong never published his findings in any conventional sense. He produced a hand-typed manuscript approximately 400 pages long that he titled Beneath the Blue Smoke, a documentary history of the underground of the Smoky Mountains. Copies of this manuscript, made on a manual typewriter and distributed by Birdsong himself, exist in at least 4 locations: the Museum of the Cherokee Indian in Cherokee, North Carolina, the Special Collections Library at Western Carolina University, the Archive of the Tennessee State Library and Archives in Nashville, and the private collection of one of Birdsong's grandchildren. The manuscript has never been digitized, never been formally cataloged, and never been cited in any peer-reviewed publication. It is known to exist to a small number of independent researchers and to a slightly larger number of Cherokee cultural heritage workers. But its contents have not been systematically evaluated by any mainstream academic institution. What is known of the manuscript's contents comes from the researchers who have actually read it, and from Birdsong's own occasional presentations at local historical society meetings, the records of which survive in part in the archives of the Swain County Historical Society. From these sources, several themes emerge that are consistent with, and in some cases extend the picture that the other evidence presents. Birdsong documented, in the section of the manuscript dealing with 19th century settler accounts, more than 60 distinct references to underground passages in the Smokies that he had found in primary documents across a 50-year period. He noted that the references clustered in 2 geographic areas: the Western Smokies in the region of the 20-mile drainage system, and the Eastern Smokies in the Cataloochee and Big Creek drainages. He argued that this clustering was not coincidental, but reflected the locations of the major access points to the tunnel network, with the clustering in the documentary record reflecting the concentration of settlement and traffic that made discovery of the passages most likely in those areas. He also documented a series of Cherokee accounts that he had collected from elderly informants in the 1920s and 1930s. People who had grown up with direct knowledge of the mountains before the establishment of the national park and before the mass displacement of the communities that had lived in the park area. These accounts, according to the summaries that appear in the Historical Society meeting records, describe the underground network in more specific terms than any published sources. They describe specific entry points, specific passage orientations, specific features within the passages, including chambers of significant size, underground water features, and in at least 2 cases, what the informants described as structures built within the passages, stone platforms or shells of uncertain purpose. The existence of structures within the passages, if accurate, would push the question of origin firmly toward deliberate human construction rather than natural feature use. Natural cave systems do not contain stone platforms or shelves. The construction of interior features within an underground passage implies a degree of long-term habitation or ceremonial use that goes beyond simple transit or extraction. It implies that someone was spending significant time in those passages for purposes that required built infrastructure, and that those purposes were stable and sustained enough over time to justify the investment. Birdsong's manuscript reportedly also contains a section dealing with what he called the geological witnesses, his term for the physical features of the landscape that he argued pointed toward the existence of the underground network independent of any documentary or oral evidence. These included patterns in the surface drainage that he argued were consistent with subsurface karst features of a scale greater than anything then formally documented in the Smoky Mountains region, patterns in the vegetation that he argued reflected unusual groundwater conditions consistent with large subsurface voids, and patterns in the topography that he argued were consistent with subsurface collapse features indicating extensive underground passages that had partially or fully collapsed. In certain areas, these geological arguments are the ones that most clearly call for expert evaluation. Birdsong was not a geologist, and his reading of landscape evidence may have been influenced by his prior commitment to the existence of the underground network. But the specific types of evidence he cited, drainage anomalies, vegetation patterns, and collapsed topography, are all legitimate proxy indicators for subsurface karst features, and a geologist with knowledge of the regional geology could evaluate Birdsong's specific claims with a site visit and the existing geological maps of the region. Nobody has done this. Nobody has gone to the Museum of the Cherokee Indian or to Western Carolina University, read Birdsong's manuscript, identified his specific geological claims, and gone out into the field to evaluate them. This is again a matter of institutional priority rather than physical impossibility. The manuscript is there. The mountains are there. The evaluation has not happened. The question of why it has not happened is one that the Birdsong case illustrates with particular clarity. Birdsong was not a credentialed researcher. His manuscript was not produced within any institutional framework that would have given it automatic standing for review by geological or archaeological professionals. The communities that knew about the manuscript and understood its potential significance, the Cherokee cultural heritage workers, and the small community of independent researchers engaged with the tunnel question, did not have the institutional connections to bring it to the attention of the people who might have acted on it. And the people who did have the institutional connections, the archaeologists and geologists at the regional universities, had no mechanism for learning about a self-published manuscript circulated primarily within Cherokee community networks. This is the pattern that defines the Smoky Mountains tunnel question in all of its dimensions. The evidence exists. The people who know about the evidence exist. The institutional capacity to evaluate the evidence exists. But the connections between these three things have not been made in any systematic or sustained way. The institutional infrastructure for interdisciplinary investigation of questions at the intersection of indigenous oral tradition, archival history, and physical geology is not robust in American academic culture, and the questions that fall precisely at that intersection tend to fall through the gaps. The Birdsong manuscript is also interesting for what it reportedly says about the content of the Cherokee oral tradition regarding the Nunnehi and the underground network in the specific historical context of the removal period in the late 1830s. The forced removal of the Cherokee people from their ancestral lands in the southern Appalachians, the process known as the Trail of Tears, was one of the most devastating events in the history of the indigenous peoples of North America. Approximately 16,000 people were forced from their homes and marched west to Indian Territory in present-day Oklahoma. Thousands died during the march and in the conditions that followed. The Cherokee people who managed to remain in North Carolina, a group that eventually formed the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, did so through a combination of legal maneuvering, local political support, and the accident of holding land titles that the state of North Carolina chose to recognize. They were a small community, numbering in the hundreds in the immediate aftermath of removal, living primarily in the mountains of what is now the Qualla boundary in Swain and Jackson counties. According to the accounts in Birdsong's manuscript, this period of crisis was also a period during which the knowledge of the underground passages was explicitly invoked in the oral tradition in ways that connected it to survival. There are accounts, reportedly preserved in the oral tradition of the Eastern Band, of people taking refuge in the underground passages during the removal period, using the network to move unseen by government troops, and maintaining contact between dispersed communities through the underground routes when surface movement was too dangerous. Whether these accounts reflect actual events or represent a mythological framework applied retrospectively to the trauma of removal is impossible to determine without more comprehensive documentation of the oral tradition than has been publicly available. But the pattern of using underground passages as refuge and escape routes during periods of violent conflict is well established in other historical contexts. The Underground Railroad in the antebellum United States, although largely metaphorical in its terminology, did involve actual underground structures in some locations, basements, root cellars, and in a small number of cases actual tunnels used to conceal and move people who were being hunted. The use of cave systems for shelter and refuge during conflict is documented in many historical contexts worldwide. The application of an existing underground network, one that was already known and maintained and navigable, to the purpose of survival during the removal crisis would have been a completely rational response to an impossible situation. It would also have created a strong incentive to maintain secrecy about the network, an incentive that may have persisted and may continue to affect the availability of specific oral knowledge about passage locations. A community that used the underground network to survive a genocidal forced removal would have very good reasons to restrict knowledge of that network to trusted insiders, and those reasons would not automatically expire with the crisis that created them. The protection of sacred and sensitive site information within indigenous communities is a legitimate and well-established practice, and the specific circumstances of the removal period would have added strong practical motivations to the existing sacred dimensions of the underground knowledge. This means that a research project seriously attempting to investigate the Smoky Mountains tunnels cannot proceed simply by reading the publicly available literature and consulting the accessible archival sources. It would need to engage genuinely and respectfully with the Cherokee community that holds the most specific knowledge, and to do so in a way that respects the community's right to determine what knowledge is appropriate to share, how it should be shared, and what the terms of any collaborative research would be. This is not a small thing. It requires a relationship, not just a consultation. It requires trust that is built over time and demonstrated through action, not just claimed in a research proposal. The Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians has a tribal historic preservation office that manages the tribe's cultural heritage interests. Any serious research project focused on the Smoky Mountains underground would need to begin there, with an initial conversation about whether the tribe is interested in collaborative research on this question, what its conditions for that collaboration would be, and what kinds of information and access it would be appropriate to seek. That conversation has not, to the best of available knowledge, been formally initiated by any mainstream academic institution. The absence of that conversation is in a sense the central obstacle to progress on the tunnel question. Everything else, the archival research, the geological survey, the remote sensing, the field investigation, depends on first establishing a relationship with the community whose heritage is at stake and whose knowledge is most directly relevant. And that relationship cannot be established without a genuine commitment to indigenous intellectual sovereignty and to research conducted on terms that the community finds acceptable. This is not simply an ethical point, although it is emphatically an ethical point. It is also a practical one. The knowledge that the Eastern Band holds about the underground network, if it is as specific as the birdsong account suggests, will be far more efficient than any amount of remote sensing as a guide to investigation. Knowing approximately where to look based on oral tradition would allow a research team to focus resources on the most productive locations, rather than conducting an expensive and time-consuming comprehensive survey of the entire park. The community's knowledge is literally the most valuable research tool available for this question, and accessing it requires the kind of relationship building that academic institutions are often poorly equipped to pursue. There's also the question of what research would mean for the community beyond simply producing academic knowledge. The documentation and formal recognition of the Smoky Mountains tunnel network, if the investigation confirmed its existence, would have implications for the management of the national park, for the Cherokee community's relationship to its ancestral landscape, and for the broader public understanding of pre-Columbian North American history. The community has interests in all of these implications that go beyond the academic question of whether tunnels exist and what they are. For the national park management, confirmation of a significant pre-Columbian underground feature would require formal site documentation, management planning to protect the feature, and potentially restrictions on certain types of recreational use in areas above confirmed passage locations. For the Cherokee community, it would represent formal recognition of a dimension of ancestral land use that has been dismissed or ignored for more than a century, and it would provide a basis for stronger formal claims on the management of the land and its cultural resources. For the broader public, it would require a revision of the standard narrative of pre-Columbian North American achievement that currently dominates popular understanding. None of these implications are simple, and none of them are universally welcomed by all parties. The national park management would face significant practical and political challenges in incorporating a major new site category into its management planning. The Cherokee community is diverse, and different members and factions within the community have different views on how aggressively to pursue formal recognition of ancestral land use and what the terms of that recognition should be. And the broader public revision of the pre-Columbian narrative, while important and warranted, involves the same kinds of resistance and adjustment that any significant historical revision encounters. These complexities are not reasons to avoid the investigation. They are reasons to conduct it carefully, with full awareness of the implications, and with genuine commitment to involving all relevant parties in the decision-making about how it proceeds and what is done with the results. The investigation of the Smoky Mountains tunnels is not just an archaeological question. It is a political and cultural question that has to be approached as such, with the seriousness and the sensitivity that political and cultural questions require. The mountains have been carrying this question for a very long time. The people who know the mountains best have been carrying it even longer. The appropriate response to that sustained, patient carrying of a question is not another footnote or another independent survey or another alternative archaeology publication. It is a genuine commitment to taking the question seriously, investing in the relationships and the resources and the methodology that taking it seriously requires, and being prepared to accept whatever answers the investigation produces, even if those answers are more complex and more challenging than the simple confirmation or refutation that would be easiest to accommodate. The Blue Smoke Mountains breathe their haze into the air over the most visited national park in the country every morning. Millions of people walk their trails every year, looking at the views, watching the wildlife, appreciating the wilderness. Very few of them know that beneath their feet there may be a layer of human history that we have not yet found the will to look for. That this landscape, which seems so purely natural in its current form, may carry within its rock the traces of a civilization that used the underground as skillfully and as purposefully as we use our highways and our warehouses and our places of worship. The investigation of that possibility is not just a contribution to academic knowledge. It is an act of justice toward the people who built what may be beneath the mountains, who used it, who remembered it, and who kept that memory alive through every difficulty and displacement that history threw at them. It is an act of honesty about what North America was before it became what it is now. And it is an act of curiosity, the most fundamentally human of impulses, followed all the way down into the dark where the answers are waiting. We owe it to ourselves to go looking, and we owe it to the mountains. There is one more dimension of this story that has not yet been addressed, and it is perhaps the most speculative, and yet in a particular way, the most important. It concerns what the tunnels, if they exist in the form the evidence suggests, might tell us not just about the past, but about the present, about how we understand the relationship between human communities and the landscapes they inhabit over long periods of time. The dominant mode of thinking about landscape in contemporary Western culture is extractive and transient. We occupy landscapes for economic reasons. We modify them for economic reasons. We leave them or attempt to restore them to some prior condition when the economic reasons for occupation change. The idea that a landscape might carry a permanent human imprint across thousands of years, that the work of previous human inhabitants might constitute a living layer of the landscape rather than simply a historical artifact buried beneath it, is genuinely foreign to this mode of thinking. Indigenous frameworks for understanding landscape tend to work differently. The concept of reciprocal relationship between human communities and specific landscapes. The understanding that the land carries memory of its inhabitants and that its inhabitants carry responsibility toward the land produces a very different relationship to the kind of long-term investment in landscape modification that the tunnel network represents. You do not build a passage through a mountain and maintain that passage across generations if you think of yourself as a transient occupant of a landscape. You build it and maintain it if you understand yourself as a permanent part of that landscape, if you're investing in a future that you expect to be there to inhabit. This is not a mystical claim. It is a practical one. The maintenance of complex infrastructure across generations requires the kind of institutional continuity and place-based identity that is characteristic of cultures with deep roots in specific landscapes. Communities that move frequently do not invest in underground passage networks. Communities that expect to remain in place, that understand their identity as bound to a specific geography across time, do invest in that kind of infrastructure because it pays off across the timescale which they plan. The Cherokee people before removal had inhabited the southern Appalachians for at least 1,000 years, and probably much longer. Their relationship to that landscape was exactly the kind of deep, permanent, place-based relationship that produces investment in long-term infrastructure. If they built or maintained the underground network, or if their ancestors did, it was because they understood themselves as permanent inhabitants of a permanent landscape, and they were managing that landscape accordingly. The removal destroyed that relationship, or attempted to. It severed the physical connection between the community and its landscape, forcing most of the population west to a different geography. The Eastern Band, by remaining in the mountains, maintained the physical connection. But the disruption of the community, the loss of population, the disruption of knowledge transmission, the trauma of the removal and its aftermath All of these affected the depth and comprehensiveness of a knowledge that could be maintained and transmitted. The tunnel knowledge, if it was maintained in its most specific form, was maintained by a much smaller community than the one that had originally held it, under conditions of severe stress and displacement. What has survived is probably incomplete. The most specific knowledge of passage locations, of the interior features of the network, of the ceremonial protocols associated with its use, may have been lost in the disruption of the removal period, or in the subsequent generations of poverty and marginalization that the community endured. What survives is the framework, the knowledge that the network exists, the understanding of its general geography, the traditions associated with it, and the sense of its significance. The details are harder to access and may in some cases no longer be accessible at all. This is another form of the loss that the removal and its aftermath represented. Not just the loss of land and lives and physical community, but the loss of specific knowledge about that land. Knowledge that was not recorded in any form that survived the disruption, and that therefore exists now only in whatever fragments were successfully transmitted through the difficult years that followed. A research project that took this dimension seriously would not only be investigating the physical tunnels. It would be contributing to the recovery and documentation of knowledge that was damaged by historical processes of dispossession and forced removal. It would be, in a small but genuine way, an act of repair, not of the tunnels themselves, which do not need our repair, but of the relationship between that knowledge and the broader public understanding of this landscape and its history. That kind of repair is slow. It happens one documented account at a time, one verified site location at a time, one conversation between researchers and community members that builds toward mutual trust and shared understanding. It does not happen quickly or dramatically, but it happens and it matters, and it is worth doing even without any guarantee of what the investigation will ultimately find. The mountains are patient. The question is whether we are. There's a particular kind of knowledge that lives at the edge of the sayable, not because it is mystical or beyond language, but because the institutional structures that translate experience into publicly recognized fact have not yet been applied to it. The knowledge exists. The people who hold it exist. The evidence that supports it exists. But the machinery that would take all of that and produce a peer-reviewed publication, a formal site report, revision to the standard textbooks has not engaged. And so the knowledge lives in the place that it has always lived, in the oral tradition of people who have been here for a very long time, in the marginal notes of surveyors and settlers who saw something they could not categorize, in the private archives of people like Birdsong, who spent their lives paying attention to what the institutions were not paying attention to, in the pattern of converging evidence that no single discipline has been assigned the task of evaluating. There is no more fitting repository, perhaps, for the knowledge of the Smoky Mountains tunnels than this distributed, informal, stubbornly persistent collection of half-told accounts and maintained oral tradition. It mirrors, in a way, the network it describes. A system of passages that connects disparate points across a complex terrain, that does not follow the most obvious routes, that requires knowledge and intent to navigate, and that has survived for a very long time despite the absence of institutional maintenance. Because the terrain itself supports it, and because the people who know it keep knowing it. The mountains of the southern Appalachians have been inhabited for longer than most of the great civilizations of the ancient world existed. The people who first arrived in these mountains, following the animals and the water and the good stone for tool making, came before the pyramids of Egypt were built, before the first cities of Mesopotamia were established, before any written language had been invented anywhere in the world. They came into a landscape that was already ancient, and they made it their own over a period of time, so long that every subsequent layer of occupation and modification seems brief by comparison. The Cherokee, who were here when the Europeans arrived, are not the first people of the Smokies. They're the most recent of a long succession of peoples, each of whom left their mark on the landscape, and each of whom passed some portion of their knowledge forward to those who came after. The tunnel network, if it exists in the form the evidence suggests, is almost certainly older than the Cherokee occupation of the region. It predates the woodland period cultures that were here before the Cherokee. It may predate the archaic period cultures that were here before them. It may have been made by people whose names we do not know and will never know, whose languages are lost, whose material culture survives only in scattered stone tools and fire-cracked rock and the barely detectable traces of settlements on the old river terraces. What those people built, if they built it, has outlasted them completely. The tunnels, if they are there, are more durable than any above-ground structure those cultures produced. Stone lasts longer than wood or bark or hide. Underground stone lasts longer than above-ground stone. A well-made passage in metamorphic rock, protected from the erosive forces of weather by being below the surface, could survive essentially intact for 10,000 years or more. The people who built it are gone. The language in which they discussed it is gone. The culture that maintained it and gave it meaning is gone, replaced by successor cultures that inherited the landscape and some of the knowledge, but not all of the context. And yet the thing itself persists, if it persists, in the dark and the quiet beneath the mountains. This is one of the most vertiginous aspects of the deep history of any landscape. The physical traces of very ancient human activity can survive when virtually everything else associated with that activity has been lost. The stone points of Paleo-Indian hunters made 13,000 years ago survive in sediment layers, where every organic trace of the people who made them has long since decomposed. Ancient hearths preserved in the same sediment layers still contain the charcoal of fires that were kindled by people whose genetics we can now read from ancient DNA, but whose individual stories we will never know. Underground passages, cut or modified in hard metamorphic rock, would similarly survive long after every other trace of the people who made them had been consumed by time and chemistry and the relentless biological recycling that characterizes the living forest of the Smokies. To encounter such a thing, if you were to encounter it, would be a strange and sobering experience. To stand in a passage cut by hands that have been dust for 10,000 years. To feel the walls that those hands smoothed and shaped. To be in a space that has been in continuous existence since before the invention of writing, before the founding of any city, before any of the historical narratives that frame our understanding of the human past had their beginning. That would be a different kind of encounter with history than anything a museum or a book can offer. It would also be a responsibility. The discovery and documentation of such a place would require decisions about access and protection and interpretation that would have profound implications for the landscape, for the Cherokee community, and for the public understanding of North American history. Those decisions would need to be made carefully and collaboratively, with full recognition of the multiple legitimate interests at stake. The Cherokee community's interest in this knowledge is primary and irreplaceable. This is their heritage in the deepest and most meaningful sense of that word. Whatever the tunnels are and whoever made them, they're part of the landscape that the Cherokee people have inhabited and maintained and remembered for as long as any account extends. The formal documentation of the tunnel network, if it occurs, should produce knowledge that belongs first to that community and that is shared with the broader public on terms that the community finds acceptable. The broader public's interest in this knowledge is also genuine. The history of North America before European contact is a history that belongs to all of us who live here now, because it is the history of this place, of the landscape we inhabit. Understanding that history more fully correcting the distortions and gaps that the colonial period introduced into our understanding of what was here before, is part of the larger project of knowing honestly where we are and how we came to be here. That honest knowing is not comfortable. It requires confronting the scale and complexity and sophistication of what was displaced by the colonial project and reckoning with the loss that displacement represented. But the discomfort is not a reason to avoid the knowledge. It is a reason to pursue it with care and with humility. The National Park Service's interest in this knowledge is practical and significant. The Great Smoky Mountains National Park is a public trust managed on behalf of all Americans and on behalf of the global community that has recognized it as a place of extraordinary natural and cultural significance. The discovery of a major pre-Columbian underground feature within the park would require management responses that the current management framework is not fully prepared for. Planning for those responses, developing the protocols, and the infrastructure for managing an underground site of this nature is something that should begin before the formal discovery occurs, not after. The conversations that need to happen between the Park Service, the Cherokee community, and the broader research community about how to proceed are conversations that can be had now without waiting for a discovery to force the issue. The academic research community's interest in this knowledge is obvious. A discovery of this magnitude would reshape the understanding of pre-Columbian North American cultural complexity and would require significant revision of the standard accounts of Appalachian prehistory. It would open new lines of research and new collaborative possibilities across the disciplines that would need to engage with such a discovery. It would be, by any measure, a significant event in the history of American archaeology and of the study of North American indigenous history. But all of this is contingent on the investigation actually happening, on someone or some group of someone's making the decision that this question is worth pursuing seriously, that the evidence taken as a whole is sufficient to warrant a genuine, well-resourced, collaborative investigation of the Smoky Mountains underground. That decision has not yet been made. It could be. The pieces are all in place. The question is whether the will exists to put them together. The blue smoke rises every morning from the ridgelines of the Smokies, curling up in the sky above the most visited national park in the country, above the most popular hiking trails in the eastern United States, above the cascading streams and the old-growth forest remnants and the meadows full of wildflowers and the valleys where black bears move through the fog before dawn. It rises from a landscape that is on its surface more natural in appearance than at any time in the last century, because the forest has grown back over the cleared land, and the roads have been removed from the wilderness areas, and the wildlife has returned to a density that the settlers of the 19th century never knew. But beneath the surface, the landscape is as old as it has ever been. The rock is as old as it has ever been. And whatever is in the rock, whatever passages and chambers and work surfaces and constructed features may exist in the metamorphic core of the oldest mountains in eastern North America, is as old as it has ever been, waiting in the dark with the patience that only ancient stone can possess. Someone should go looking with good equipment and good questions and good faith and good relationships with the people who know these mountains best. Someone should go beneath the blue smoke, down into the rock and the dark and the quiet, and find out what is there. The mountains have been waiting long enough, and so really have we. And there is one final thing worth saying before this story settles into the dark with the mountains themselves. The reason that the Smoky Mountains tunnel question matters is not just the tunnels. It is what the tunnel question represents about how we know what we know about the human past, and about the consequences of the gaps in that knowing. Every landscape on this planet has a human history that predates the written record. Every landscape contains traces of human activity that are older than any document, older than any institution, older than any of the categories we use to organize our understanding of the past. Those traces are unevenly distributed in their survival and in their recognition, but they are everywhere. The question of whether we bother to look for them, whether we take the available evidence seriously enough to invest in the investigation, and whether we approach that investigation with enough humility and enough respect for the communities that have maintained knowledge of those traces across generations, is a question that recurs in every landscape. The Smoky Mountains are one place where that recurring question has a particularly well-documented and particularly long-standing body of evidence attached to it. The answer to the question there, whether the investigation happens or not, whether the tunnels are confirmed or not, will say something about the broader capacity of our institutions and our culture to take the deep history of specific landscapes seriously. It will say something about whether we are capable of the kind of attention and investment that recovering lost history requires. That is a high-stakes thing to say about a question that a great many people have never heard of, and that most of those who have heard of it regard as a curiosity at the edge of the mainstream. But the stakes of deep historical knowledge are always high, even when the question seems marginal. How we understand the past shapes how we understand the present. The story we tell about who was here and what they built and what they knew determines what we think is possible and what we think we owe to the landscape and to the communities whose heritage we are in some sense all inheriting. The Blue Smoke Mountains breathe their daily haze into the air and hold their secrets in the rock and wait. And somewhere in the oral tradition of the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, in the 400-page typescript in the museum archive, in the unverified observations of independent researchers, in the geological structure of the oldest peaks in eastern North America, the answer to one of the continent's most enduring historical questions rests, patient and present, waiting for the question to finally be asked properly. Ask it, follow it down, see what is there. That is ultimately what the mountains are for. One more thing, one more thread that runs through this story, and that deserves a few words before we let it rest. The accounts that appear in the marginal documentary record of the Smoky Mountains tunnels, the surveyor's letters, the settler oral histories, the newspaper items, the geological footnotes, all of them come from people who were surprised by what they found. Surprise is an important signal. It means the encounter did not fit expectations. It means the person describing the encounter was not telling a story they had been primed to tell or that they expected to find. Surprise is evidence of genuine encounter with something genuinely unexpected. The consistency of surprise across accounts that are otherwise varied in their specifics, varied in their locations, their time periods, their observers, and their descriptive details, is another form of the independent convergence that characterizes the Smoky Mountains tunnel evidence as a whole. People who encountered something in the mountains that they could not categorize, who noted it and reported it because it seemed important even though they had no framework for understanding its importance, who did so without any awareness that other people in other times had encountered the same thing. Those people are the most reliable witnesses in the historical record. They had nothing to gain from their reports. They were not building a case or advancing a theory. They were simply noting what they saw in the margins of other accounts and moving on. Those marginal notes, accumulated across more than 2 centuries, form a picture that is worth taking seriously, not as proof, but as invitation. As the first chapters of a story whose later chapters have not yet been written, because no one has yet committed to writing them. The mountains are not going anywhere. The evidence is not going anywhere. The question is not going anywhere. And the people who have been keeping this knowledge alive across generations of difficulty and displacement and institutional neglect are still here, still holding what they know, still waiting for the conversation to become serious enough to be worth having fully. The full conversation with all the resources and all the rigor and all the respect that it deserves is what the Smoky Mountains tunnels have always been waiting for. That conversation begins, as all real conversations do, with the willingness to listen. To the mountains, to the evidence, and most of all to the people who have been here the longest, who know this landscape from the inside, and who have been saying in one form or another across all the years of recorded contact with the wider world that beneath the blue smoke, in the rock, in the dark, in the deep quiet of the oldest peaks in the east, there is something worth finding. Go find it. There will come a morning, perhaps not soon, perhaps in the lifetime of someone not yet born, when a team of researchers will walk into the Great Smoky Mountains with the right equipment and the right relationships and the right questions, and they will descend into the rock and return with something that changes how this continent understands itself. It will not be a dramatic moment. Real discoveries rarely are. It will be methodical, careful, documented, repeated, verified. It will take years to fully interpret and decades to fully incorporate into the broader understanding of North American prehistory. But it will happen. The evidence is too convergent, the question too specific, the landscape too geologically capable of containing what the accounts describe. At some point, the investigation will happen. When it does, the people who laid the groundwork for it, the Cherokee elders who maintained the oral tradition through the worst years of removal and its aftermath, the marginal note-takers of the 19th century who wrote down what they saw without knowing why it mattered, the independent researchers who pursued the question without institutional support, the birdsongs of the world who spent their lives at the intersection of things that were not supposed to connect, all of them will be part of how the discovery was eventually made. The story of how the Smoky Mountains tunnels were found, whenever it happens, will be a story about patience and persistence and a refusal to let a real question disappear into institutional silence. That is a story worth being part of, in whatever way is available to us. Even if our part is only this, to have listened, to have found the question interesting, to have carried the shape of the mystery forward one more night into the world. There is something quietly radical about refusing to let a question die, simply because the institutions responsible for answering it have not yet chosen to engage. The history of human knowledge is full of questions that spent long periods in exactly this condition, acknowledged at the margins, maintained by people outside the mainstream, waiting for the combination of evidence and attention that would eventually bring them into the center. The Smoky Mountains tunnel question has been in that condition for a very long time. The evidence has not diminished with the waiting. If anything, it has grown as each decade adds more independent accounts, more converging geological arguments, more oral tradition documentation, more remote sensing data that points in the same direction. The case grows stronger while the investigation remains unmade. That is an unusual situation and an unstable one. At some point, the weight of evidence will tip something, some researcher or institution or collaborative partnership, toward the decision to look properly. When it does, the long patience of the mountains will finally meet the long patience of the people who have been saying for generation after generation that the mountains are worth looking into. Not just for the view from the top, but for what lies within. And the mystery beneath them kept your mind drifting in the right direction. You can tap the like button gently, just a quiet signal that more stories like this would be welcome. Subscribe if you want to keep exploring the hidden histories of the world while you rest. And if you feel awake enough, leave a comment telling me where in the world you are listening from, what time it is, whether there are mountains outside your window, or just the ordinary dark of wherever you are tonight. Every location adds another point to the map of people who are drawn to the same questions in the same quiet hours. That is its own kind of network, its own kind of connection across distance, not so different from the trade routes that crossed the Appalachians thousands of years ago. Rest well. The mountains are still out there, keeping their secrets with patience that outlasts all of us. Also, like and subscribe to my channel. Ancient Tales sleep. Good night, sweet dreams.